Hi, everyone. I wanted to say welcome to all of our online participants for this first session of the four-part series of LENINFEST 2020. Before the introduction, I'd like to quickly say that people are able to choose the language of their interpretation down at the bottom of the screen. So today's session is Lenin's Imperialism in the 21st Century, featuring panelist Antonio Tujan of the IBON Foundation and the Institute for Political Economy. April 22nd marks the 150th anniversary of the birth of Lenin. Not only is Lenin one of the greatest historical figures of all time, Lenin's thinking continues to have relevance for those of us who strive to build a new society based on peace, the just distribution of wealth between peoples and nations, and the attainment of a meaningful life for all. Just over 100 years ago, the October Revolution swept the Bolshevik Party to power in the Soviet Union. Lenin led a historically significant consolidation of working class in the Revolutionary Party, a revolutionary party which oversaw the nationalization of lands and assets from the aristocracy, land and wealth redistribution to the people, and the development of a workers' state with free mass education, free healthcare, and worker rights and protections, which saw life expectancy in the Soviet Union rise from under 49 years, over 10 years, in some of the most public interventions in history. Now, considering our current context of the health and economic crisis in Canada, Lenin's analysis of how imperialism consolidates wealth and power in the hands of the rich and his revolutionary political practices to smash imperialism's hold on the people holds great importance for us at this conjuncture. In Canada, in March alone, employment plummeted by 1 million. And by mid-April, over 5.4 million people in Canada had received federal aid. As it turns out, no surprise to some of us, essential workers in agriculture, food production and distribution, and community-based and long-term health care are some of the lowest paid and least protected workers. And yet these workers are the very ones who keep our society running. As wealth continues to flow from the exploited nations to the imperialists and from the working classes to the bourgeoisie. Rather than a worker-run society which protects the people and where wealth is shared, our government in Canada seeks to protect big business at the expense of the people. Now more than ever, Lenin's insights, his revolutionary experiences and practices are relevant to the people of the world. A quick word about our host organization. The International League of People's Struggles in Canada is a country chapter of an international anti-imperialist and democratic formation which promotes, supports, and develops the anti-imperialist and democratic struggles of the peoples of the world against imperialism and all reaction. Today's panelist is Antonio Tujan, a founding member of the IBON Foundation, the Philippine-based progressive research and education institution, which provides analysis on issues of pressing concern to people's movements and organizations. Antonio also represents the Institute for Political Economy, which generates policy alternatives to global economic issues. And finally, he is an active member of the International League of People's Struggles. Today's forum, the flow that will happen is that Antonio will give us a presentation, after which I will engage Antonio in a series of questions. And then finally, we will open the floor to the audience through questions via the Q&A bubbles at the bottom. Please ensure that your video is off and your mic is muted to ensure the best quality for our presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much, Martha. Good day to all of you, and I'm very pleased to be here. For us, Lenin is a very important leader that clarified to us the issue of imperialism in particular, and also in leading the socialist revolution in Russia. For us, Lenin's work on imperialism provides us a very important framework by which we understand the conditions that are happening in the world today, especially with the COVID crisis. And as you look around you in the world, you'll find different countries. And oftentimes you wonder which one, how do you analyze each country, the leadership of each country, the ruling class of each country. And Lenin provides us in a thesis, in a critique that he made more than 110 years ago. His work on imperialism provides us the basic principles by which we understand imperialism and we apply it. As today, Lenin's teachings remain very relevant for us as workers, as activists, as people of the world. Lenin's political economic basis provides us an understanding of international events and the processes that's happening, including in understanding the bourgeoisie in each country, the governments that are leading those governments, and how they operate. Further, uh, Lenin provides us the political economic basis to understand the workings in each country and how the workers are being exploited and how imperialist powers are operate all over the world. The 5 features that Lenin provided us in understanding imperialism was very important in his time because at that time people did not understand how the bourgeoisie at that time operated. And that's when Lenin actually clarified that there is now a new phase of capitalism, which is the highest stage of capitalism. This monopoly capitalism gives us a better understanding of workings in the world at his time. And now these features remain in place. In the 20th century, you have the World War I, the global crisis, and until the World War II, you find another period or a substage of imperialism by which the US became the prominent imperialist power and creating managing the competition among imperialist powers and collaborating. And in this context also embarking on a Cold War against the socialist camp. By 1980, you find the maturation of the crisis of monopoly capital. And there they rolled out the neoliberal policy and globalization by which they hope that they can stave off the maturation of the crisis of monopoly capitalism. And coupled with this is a permanent war policy by which you find a continuous wars of aggression, conflicts, and armaments in the world today. But by 2013, we now face the post-prime crisis or the post-prime period of imperialism. You now have the period of multipolar politics where China and other countries that have become capitalist now challenge the primacy of the US. And you add to that the question of climate change and the COVID crisis. In a sense, these 4 sub-periods of imperialism shows us that still you have the workings of the 5 features of imperialism. First, Lenin teaches us that the world now, since the turn of the 20th century, all the capitalist countries are now defined by monopoly operations. You have all sorts of monopolies and monopsonies, domestic cartels operating, but this operation continues today, meaning to say in each country, in each capitalist country and an imperialist country, you'll find monopolies that are dictating the economies and the markets in these countries. At the same time, even in non-capitalist countries, such as the Sene colonies, you'll find some proto-monopolies that operate. The second feature of Lenin is the merger of the industrial and the financial bourgeoisie, creating a financial oligarchy. You'll find since that time and up to now that the financial houses, the banks like J. Morgan, Chase, Manhattan, continue to control industry rather than the way around in the previous period of free capitalism. Now you have a situation where industries, manufacturers are being controlled by the financial oligarchy. The third feature of imperialism is the export of capital. Here, you'll find that the monopoly capitalists need to invest or export capital in various ways in order to stave off their crisis. Because of overproduction, excess capital has to be exported in various ways. One, through trade, which is already an old form, but now you have investments into different natural resources concerns. Up to now, you have the export processing zones. You also have investments in the context of debt and development assistance, which flow back into the imperialist countries. And therefore, you'll find that you find that in the fourth feature of imperialism, you have the operation of international cartels and the conglomerates. If there were conglomerates already in the capitalist countries as a form of a higher level of monopolies, in the international arena, you'll find bigger conglomerates among transnational corporations, multinational corporations, and the merger of many transnational corporations, so much so that in this day and age, you'll find that every industrial sector is controlled by 5 or even less conglomerates that lords over each global industry. The fifth feature, of course, is imperialism divides the world into spheres of influence. And to do that, you have the practice of neocolonialism and also a form of patronage or clientelism with other countries which are not neo-colonies. And this leads us to wars of aggression, conflict among imperialist powers, and in the end, the looming threat of a world war. Under the primacy of the US, where we now find a peculiar situation, and that's why it's been called the US century. The 20th century is called the US century in the sense that the US used its victory in the World War II decimated other imperialist powers, helped rebuild them, such as the of Europe, and in the process, I controlled the finance of the world through the IMF and the World Bank, controlled trade through the GATT, which eventually became WTO, controlled the United Nations, and created eventually the G7. These are the 7 imperialist powers into a club by which they are able to collude and compete with each other under the US leadership. But they had to face the threat of competition from an increasingly powerful socialist bloc. The problem is, in the course of that competition, you find that revisionism had turned the Soviet Union and other parties into their own phase of capitalism, of the bourgeoisie. And you have the emergence of social imperialism. And you now have 2 hegemonic powers. One, the US with the Western imperialist powers in its wing, and the Soviet bloc with the social imperialist Soviet Union at the time.
Antonio,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
I think for some people the sound is quite choppy, so Malcolm is suggesting we pause for a minute and switch to the phone.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry for that, folks. My computer gave up on the sound. I was talking about what I said was one phase of imperialism, which is after World War II, up to the end of the boom of 2000 by 1980. This period is basically 1945 to 1980, or more than 40 years of the U.S. lording over as the hegemonic power of the world, but creating an imperialist alliance, but at the same time using the Cold War or the attack on the Soviet camp as a pretext to rally the imperialist powers against the so-called communist threat. But in the end, the collapse of the Soviet Union after 1980 also meant that you now have a new period that was the end of a period where the U.S. became the empire, if you will, being the sole superpower of the world. In this period also, on one hand, the U.S. controlled, they lorded over the global economy, becoming the richest country of the world. But at the same time, you have the implementation of neoliberalism, the financialization of the economy, and brought imperialism to obscene levels by which countries were further made poor, by which they had centralized, in a sense, the control of countries over the world through structural adjustment, the WTO, and others. And this is the period of the height of the TNCs, the conglomerates around the world. At the same time, the U.S. implemented a permanent war policy, a continuing war policy that combined both the creation of the military-industrial complex, the NATO, and before the SEATO, the troop deployments and bases all over the world, invasions of countries that the U.S. deemed are go rogue, the subversion of countries also, of governments and societies, the explosion of the intelligence community, space exploration, nuclear armaments, and finally high-tech weaponry. Now, in the end, you'll find that all of these meant that the U.S. was able now to lord even more after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You now have the triumphalism of the neocon, the offensive in the Middle East, the Iraq, and others, the so-called axis of evil. But there's limits to imperialism, and what they thought that neoliberalism is the saving grace of the maturation of the extreme crisis of monopoly capital. The point is they have drawn already the limits of imperialist exploitation and the boundaries of the planet. You now have the extreme crisis from the 90s up to 2008. You know, the second crisis in 2008 was the start of a depressionary crisis that up to now imperialism has not recovered from. You find no real growth in any of the imperialist countries, except of course China, which now had been able to use the crisis to have double-digit growth for more than 20 years, and of course up to the current situation. You have now a situation that was translated from China's growth into a multipolar world, a post-prime period for the U.S., where the U.S. is no longer the hegemon, where the U.S. now can be trumped by Russia and China in its efforts to attack Venezuela, or even in the case of Syria. You now have a situation where you have the U.S. tries to use militarism, war, and others to try to recover its primacy period in the world. This situation means that having driven to the limits of the earth and imperialist exploitation, this extreme crisis will pursue, that has started from 2008, has even become worse under COVID. The role of financial liberalization is such that they thought from 2008 to now that they can still seek escape for investment that is constantly seeking which country they can drive their investment and profit from, creating bubbles from one country to the other. Overproduction remains, and it cannot be mitigated anymore. You have the severe impact on the workers and the peoples on the world in terms of severe poverty, especially from the global south, but also in the global north, where you'll find that the workers and the migrants living in third world conditions, while at the same time they have fattened up the labor bosses, the labor aristocrats. You have the impact of climate change, environmental disaster, and now the emergence of viruses and pathogens as a result of climate change, but also because of the extreme neoliberal impact, the impact of neoliberal globalization on the earth and on production. What it means, of course, is a changing geopolitics, something where it becomes important for us to understand which are the imperialist countries and which are not. It doesn't follow if a country is a power, like Turkey or Indonesia, they are imperialist. We have to learn from the principles taught to us from Lenin, which countries are imperialists, fulfill the 5 features, whereas in other countries, because of neoliberalism, you'll find some apparently features, but it's not imperialism. You'll find in the world today that Jollibee wants to be in the top 5, food companies of the world. And the Philippines is not even capitalist. You'll find Turkey, which is asserting itself as a power, in a sense, by attacking the Kurds and other people in Syria and in the environs such as Cyprus. But does the bourgeoisie of Turkey fulfill the features of imperialism? Is the state of Turkey imperialist? And by understanding the operations of imperialism, to understand the role of the G7, which still exists, and at the same time, the role of Russia, China, India, Brazil, and others, could you then say that Brazil is imperialist? It's important to us in understanding as the country, as the world starts to go in a downhill slide of imperialism, and as we fight imperialism to realize socialist victory, we have to fight our struggles in every country. Thank you.
Hi, Antonio. Thank you very much for that presentation. So before we open the floor to the audience, to the attendees, please post your questions in the question and answer. And shortly we will be drawing questions from that venue. But before we do that, I have a couple of questions for you, Antonio. The first one is a question about financial speculation. The question is, how does the phenomenon of financialization and financial speculation and the so-called casino economy, as Castro described it, fit with Lenin's understanding of the emergence of finance capital?
Lenin already said that with the emergence of the financial oligarchy, you'll find the overweening role of the stock market and financial houses, because then the role of the financial sector takes precedence on the real economy. That has started then, but under neoliberalism, they had created even more structures of financialization, meaning to say that they have created more speculative forms of financial instruments like derivatives and others that originally was meant to manage risk for investors. But management of risks became management of risks, and the management of the risk became basically the financialization. For example, if you have a factory and you want to manage your risk in your factory, then you create a portfolio. So you buy land, and that is where you're able to, develop to ensure that you don't lose so much if your factory, collapses. And you have an example like a pipe company in the Philippines or any company, and they would start investing in other instruments, in real estate and so on. And that is your portfolio. And from there, before long, you'll find that actually the financialization of this becomes the determinant of investment decisions and so on. And you start playing it. You are playing it in the stock market. You are playing it in derivatives such as bonds and other instruments to manage your risk, insurance, and so on. This becomes your portfolio, and that is, it becomes a casino by which you are financializing your risk from the real economy into financialization through instruments of investment in financial instruments. And that financialization allows you now to move money where you can find better returns. And in a sense, you still make money as a gambler. You can lose money as well. You can hedge your bets and so on. And you don't care anymore that the real economy is in shambles. You look for where I can have another crap table or whatever. And that's why it has become a casino.
Thank you for that. One more question for you before we move to the participant questions. Inter-imperialist rivalry has returned with a vengeance, as you were talking about the post-2008 financial crisis. And wars of redivision of the world seem imminent. So how did Lenin come to understand inter-imperialist rivalry as a permanent feature of imperialism?
Lenin warned that the division of the world into spheres of influence means that imperialism means war. At the time, what it meant was, in Lenin's time, it was about World War I. And of course, after the World War I, you have different wars in between, and eventually, of course, the conflicts that led to World War II. And that's why Lenin says imperialism means war. And the U.S. Actually put it in, brought it to another notch level, in the sense that it now created instruments by which imperialism can collude and at the same time compete. And so since then, you'll find that we have never seen peace, that imperialism will always find, since the time of Lenin, you'll always find forms of aggression, invasion, and other, conflicts, because essentially imperialism seeks fascist forms, militarist forms to implement their conflict. In the case of now, you'll find that Trump and even Angela Merkel accusing China and claiming that China should pay damages for the COVID. China, therefore, has become, in the first place, the biggest threat to Western imperialism, if you will, or the existing imperialist powers, because China had built up such capital, imperialist, monopoly capitalist capital, that it was able to create the infrastructure bank, the International Development Bank. It also created all sorts of instruments of investment, such as the Belt and Road. It created a new formation, the BRICS, by which it is able to coordinate emerging powers and also capitalist countries, not necessarily imperialist. And you'll find that by 2013, China had shifted in a clearer fashion its policies in economy, geopolitics, and the military. China now implemented stronger armament, military buildup. China actually is now the fastest growth in terms of armaments buildup after the US. It actually also is the second country which has now several military bases outside of China, not to mention the West Philippine Sea. You'll find that China has created the G77 plus China, by which you now have a clear geopolitical opposition to the G7. And because of this, China has become the prime, the pole by which the other imperialist powers like Japan, Germany, and even India are now attacking China because of the threat that China provides. Of course, the US is the main watchdog, the one who has been attacking China from the first start, even in the context of COVID.
So we have a question from a participant, Benjamin. I'm going to read this to you, Antonio. Benjamin asks, ILPS understands the Philippines as a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country, but does that mean the primary mode of production in the Philippines is not capitalist? Given that we live under global monopoly finance capital, would we not say that every country, aside arguably from the few socialist countries, is capitalist, including ones under colonial conditions?
It doesn't mean, under Lenin's definition, you will now find neo-colonial countries who are in effect dependent countries to periphery. But it doesn't follow that countries.
What are you saying? I mean, she's been working and I'm taking over now. What are you talking about? Who are you saying this to?
Are capitalist. You'll find that countries like the Philippines, many colonial countries, are not really capitalist in the sense, because many of them, or most of them, are pre-capitalist in their social formation. The Philippines, for example, it has semi-feudal features. Landlordism exists. And therefore, it doesn't follow that because a country is in the periphery, it is dependent on the monopoly and the metropolis. It doesn't follow that that country is capitalist. We have this same analysis and conferences in Africa to see if Africa is capitalist, because of course the theory is that African countries are dependent, capitalist.
Des pays dépendants.
But when we started
Mais
studying
quand on a
Senegal,
commencé
for
à étudier
example,
le Sénégal,
or
par
Kenya,
exemple, ou le
you'll
Kenya,
find that the
vous allez
population
voir que la
is
population
really pre-capitalist
est
in
vraiment
character, that
pré-capitaliste de nature,
the bulk of the
et
economy
que
is not
la
capitalist
majeure
in
partie de
character,
l'économie n'est pas
although because
capitaliste,
they are dependent
mais
to
parce qu'ils sont
imperialism,
dépendants
then
de
you'll find the
l'impérialisme,
operations
vous allez
of
voir
compradors.
l'opération des
In the
compradors.
Philippines, as in many other
Aux
countries,
Philippines, comme dans beaucoup
the
d'autres
real
pays,
national capitalist is very small.
le
These
capital
countries
national est très petit.
are led by
Et
a
ces
big
pays sont
bourgeoisie that
dirigés
is
par une grande
comprador
bourgeoisie qui
in
est
character.
comprador
And that is far, far
et qui
different
est très,
from
très
a real
différent
national
d'un
capitalist
vrai
bourgeoisie
capitalisme
leading a
national et d'une
So,
bourgeoisie
for example,
nationale.
New Zealand
Par
is
exemple, la
not
Nouvelle-Zélande
imperialist,
n'est pas
but New
impérialiste,
Zealand has
mais
a
la
national
Nouvelle-Zélande
bourgeoisie.
a une bourgeoisie
New
nationale.
Zealand is a
Et la
capitalist country,
Nouvelle-Zélande est un pays
but
capitaliste.
it is, of course,
Mais bien sûr,
dependent to a certain degree to Australia, but to US in the main.
So as a follow-up to that point, Antonio, how does an economic analysis that incorporates that understanding of imperialism shape the role of the Revolutionary Party in national contexts?
It becomes very important for us as we fight imperialism to work for socialism. But to fight imperialism, we must understand the class structure of each country and to understand the political economy of that country. And so a country like the Philippines, you will find that the big part of the society is not composed of the industrial proletariat. It's composed of the semi-proletariats, meaning to say the peasants, the agricultural workers, and a big part also the moving semi-proletariat, meaning to say you have the agricultural workers in the rural areas, but they also migrate to the urban areas. That's why you have a big amount of semi-proletariat as urban poor, but actually also moving from city to town, city to rural area. So for us, for the revolution in the Philippines, it's important to mobilize this semi-proletariat with the workers, the peasants, in a war that is not dictated in the context of the liberal traditions, if you will, in the North, in a situation where you have fascist and feudal powers that operate in all over the country, and therefore you have to achieve socialism through a people's war. In the case of capitalist countries, you will not find peasantry. What you will find, of course, are workers all over. And therefore, it's our responsibility to conduct social investigation and class analysis to realize how it operates. So we have a branch in Senegal. That is where you have also a healthy community of Marxists. And you'll find that there are also many Marxists in Senegal who are really looking at the situation of the rural Senegal. And you have a situation where the people are actually living in situations that are combination of semi-feudal conditions and semi-capitalist relations. And the majority of the people of Senegal are not in the context of capitalism or the proletariat. For them, they have to work to organize the people who are living in conditions of tribalism, but at the same time, you have semi-feudal relations of workers, of peasants working as agricultural workers in the rural areas. And they have to organize there. Of course, what happened was they faced, terrible repression. Everywhere, when you start organizing in the rural areas as well as in the cities, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a piece of cake.
I have another question for you here, Antonio, from a participant, Ryan. Ryan asks, there was a lot of talk on the left about the current collapse of the US empire. In your opinion, what are the biggest signs that this is happening? Is it possible that the US could regain its hegemony again in the future?
The collapse of the empire, it has not, it's in the process of collapse, by the way. Meaning to say the US, the mighty dollar remains mighty, but it is challenged by the euro and the yuan. You will find that a lot of investment that is going around the world is no longer according to the dollar. But you have a situation also that the U.S. Treasury continues, the U.S. government continues to print dollars. So you have this phenomenon of the dollar having its own life in different countries that is no longer controlled in the U.S. But you'll find that the collapse of the primacy of the U.S. is both an expression of the conflict with China, secondly with Russia. But the other feature of this collapse is the fact that the U.S. Productive capacity and the abandonment of the bourgeoisie, of the workers, in the economic heartland of the U.S. So you'll find in the U.S. malls that are being mothballed. In the U.S., the conditions of poverty is equivalent to that of the global South. The situation of the workers in the form of the colored people who are marginalized extremely from the workforce and living in poverty or in prisons are the expressions of that collapse. But oftentimes we look at that in the context of the global economy and geopolitics, and that's why what is more apparent is this collapse of the primary role of the empire. But it has not collapsed yet because the U.S. remains the centurion, meaning to say the U.S. remains the key, the key post, in a sense, by, on one hand, creating a security pole of the imperialist system, and at the same time attacking the countries and forces that is a threat to its survival, and also on the other hand the role of the dollar by which the world is still the finances of the world is still mediated. And in that sense, a moribund imperialist power cannot collapse because it has created, it's holding the posts of the monopoly capital all over the world. For that to collapse, it has to contend with China. And as it contends with China, then it creates the conditions by which the workers are able to create a better world.
I just want to quickly ask, because Kota Kimura, excuse me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, you had your hand up. And I just wanted to verbally acknowledge that we saw your hand up and ask if you did have a question you wanted to put to Antonio, if you could type it in the question and answer bubble, that would be great. So I think what we'll do is we'll take 2 more questions and then we will wrap. But before, Antonio, I give you the next question, I wanted to say to the participants that continue to put your questions in the Q&A, even if we won't answer them tonight. This is the first of a 4-part series of discussion on the relevance of Lenin for the 21st century as a part of LENINFEST 2020. So continue to post your questions, and even if we don't answer them tonight, we will continue to go back to them in the future sessions. So Antonio, the next question for you, which is also a great segue to the session next week, which is looking at Canadian foreign policy. So the question from Louisa is, with the primacy of the United States, there was debate on Canada being imperialist and how to frame the nature of the Canadian state. ILPS Canada has used the term junior imperialist. Can you talk about the relationship between junior imperialist and primary imperialist country?
Yeah, so I have already talked about Turkey or Indonesia being imperialist, and they're not. But Canada is indeed an imperialist country. And however, the main imperialist countries are actually Germany, the UK, to a certain degree France. But you'll find that other imperialist countries like Australia, Canada, and even Japan are under the wings of the US. And in that sense, we call them, they can be considered junior imperialists because there are specific limitations that have been created and which the monopoly capital in Canada or Australia have accepted. So Australia, for example, has limited its sphere of influence to the Pacific and, part of East Asia. It is the Philippines and Indonesia. And at the same time, its role is as, holding the fort militarily for the US. In the same way that you have that kind of relationship with Japan, where the US has accepted to develop its security or its police powers. And for Canada, the fact that Canada is indeed imperialist because its formation in terms of its capital, its role in terms of creating its own sphere of influence. But you'll notice that Canada's role is not a separate sphere of influence. It follows the role, the dictates of the US. You'll find that Canada invested heavily in terms of aid and military on Afghanistan as a junior imperialist power to the US. So Canada accepts that role in the same way that Canada is also enmeshed in the conglomerates of the US in terms of energy and in terms of heavy industry. And therefore, in different aspects, you'll find that Canada is an imperialist power, but does not have its own direct role as a power or an influence, where you'll find that that sphere influence is expressed through the military incursions, its presence, its economic presence, among others.
Great. Thank you for that answer, Antonio. And last question before we wrap for tonight. And I've sent out a message to all of the attendees just saying you can continue to post your questions in the Q&A. This is the first of a 4-part series, so we can pick up those questions at future sessions. So Antonio, last question from Remy. Can you explain some of the contradictions between the USA and some transnational organizations it has power over and tends to use to push its own agenda, such as the UN and the International Monetary Fund? For example, the IMF wishes to provide aid, quote unquote, to Iran, but the US opposes this due to sanctions. Where do these contradictions, excuse me, where do these contradictions come from, and what do you think the implications of them are?
The imperialism and the US, the contradiction comes from the fact that in the world today, there's supposed to be an international system. That international in international relations, global, international law dictates that we respect every country, a people, their government, and so on. Which means to say you have a system in the world by which a country that has a different system or does not subscribe to the dictates of imperialism has to be respected. This has been the fight of the century. When the socialism emerged in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet bloc, you have this conflict regarding how to, what should be the humane way to relate to countries among each other. And that conflict is a contradiction within the United Nations, because the United Nations, along with the operations of TNCs and international bodies, is that all countries are member of intergovernmental organizations and have their own stake and rights in those bodies. And therefore, the question of sanctions becomes debatable. When can the United Nations or the IMF accept those sanctions? And therefore, you will understand deeper the workings of these intergovernmental bodies, because you'll find that the imperialist powers try to use this to use these bodies in their oppression of other countries and societies. So the question of sanctions is an example. When do sanctions? When are sanctions acceptable? And you'll find that sanctions are actually an instrument of imperialism to allow it freedom to oppress and invade countries. And sanctions remain a form by which, to a certain degree, imperialist powers like the U.S., elbow their way, ensure that other countries toe the line. So, for example, you have the case of Iran, and you'll find that the European Union accepted that they buy the oil of Iran using euros, despite the sanctions. Now, on one level, you have the geopolitical contradictions, and then you have another level by which you'll find that the TNCs now implement the trade, financial, and other relations, but the TNCs have to follow the intergovernmental agreements. So you have the how do you call this? The intersection of conflict between imperialism with countries, or imperialism among each other, or imperialism in relation to certain countries like Venezuela or Iran. And then on the other hand, how you have the conflict between the interests of TNCs in relation to their operations in these countries.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Antonio. It was definitely a great launch to further our understanding of the relevance of Lenin, Lenin's analysis and understanding for the 21st century. I think we'll wrap it there. For the question, Louisa posted a question that we didn't answer on looking at the challenges of organizing the proletariat within the imperialist center. And I think that question we could pick up at future sessions. So that's a wrap for today's session. Thank you for your participation in the panel this evening, and thanks to all of the attendees. Just a reminder that our next session, session number 2 of LENINFEST 2020, will be next Tuesday, April 28th, the same time, so 9 p.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Pacific Time. And that session will be on Canada's imperialist foreign policy, which will be hosted by ILPS in Canada again, and will feature panelist Yves Engler, who is an activist and an author. His latest book is House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. So I think we'll be digging more into that question of Canada's role as an imperialist country. And so please do join us next Tuesday, April 28th. And for those of you who would like to get more information on the International League of People's Struggles in Canada, I'll read out our website here. It is ilps-canada.ca. So again, ilps-canada.ca, and you can also find the International League of People's Struggles in Canada on Facebook. So we hope to connect with you all again next Tuesday. You can find more information about LENINFEST, as well as hopefully the recordings of the sessions online. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.